What's the good word, y'all? It's your boy DKB here. So we have our star running back, Breece Hall, firing off some shots, which is pretty interesting, right? Breece Hall, he's a very quiet beast for the most part. When he does speak up, generally it's due to a post-game press conference, maybe more so specifically during losses. And in situations now where, you know, we have the world of Twitter and stuff, or X now, I should say, that's taking dominance, right, when it comes to thoughts. We had a recent tweet from Breece Hall where he's directly called out, or I shouldn't say directly, but he has called out Nathaniel Hackett and Joe Douglas as the architects of this New York Jets roster, and then of course Hackett being our offensive coordinator and needing to put his players in the best position. So he tweeted out, the way the Detroit Lions the way they, being the Detroit Lions, using Jameer right now, it's a running back's dream. Now, there were some numbers that X Factor was able to drop recently in terms of Jameer Gibbs' usage and stuff, but overall, Gibbs, the rookie, he's had himself a strong premier rookie season, right? I think he just also eclipsed the 1,500 scrimmage yard mark. And keep in mind, there was a couple weeks in the beginning of the season for the Lions where it looked like they didn't really know what they wanted to do with Gibbs, and maybe that was the case. But they ultimately ended up figuring it out with his skill set, his ability, the speed that he brought to ultimately make it look like it wasn't a wasted pick, with him being selected at, I believe it was 12 in the first round of the 2023 draft. So they figured it out. Breece Hall is looking for the same thing, right? And essentially, you can't really argue with the rushing plan, right? Not many people are aware of, you know, what he's doing, what's happening when he's running in between tackles versus cutting things back, versus hitting the outside, you know, sweeps, etc., right? A lot of us maybe aren't that in tune with it, and maybe so we don't even care too much there, right? But in the receiving game, it's pretty clear that he hasn't been utilized as much as he should. And this goes into a whole different conversation, but we know the infamous quote now from Nathaniel Hackett where he didn't know until like week 8 that he had a receiving star on his hands in Breece Hall, which just brought into question so many things. When you came in, arguably, Breece Hall should have been the number one weapon that you were ultra familiar with, right? Every strength that he has, the few weaknesses that you can find, and how to mitigate those, and of course accentuate the strengths. But to blatantly say that you didn't realize he was an effective receiver is blasphemy. It would have been a reason for me to solely look at firing him right there on the spot. I wouldn't say that's a bout of stage fright or temporary incompetence. That is, it's ignorance at its best, right? Putting that aside, though, you take a look at what they've done in the receiving game with Breece Hall. The versatility really isn't there, right? He had 10 snaps in the slot, which only made up 2.4% of his total, plays. And then 43 snaps on the outside, basically lining up as a wide receiver. That was 10.5% of the time, which is a more acceptable number, but that came much later into the season after Nathaniel Hackett, quote unquote, figured it out with Breece Hall. So, I don't know, putting that aside, right, that's one element to it. Breece Hall obviously wants to become that ultimate trump card for the New York Jets offense, but then we had the shot at the front office and Joe Douglas, where he reposted a comment from our former NFL offensive lineman Damian Woody, who said how some teams neglect the offensive line is criminal. And this is a point that I'll continue to fight, although it generally falls on deaf ears. What Joe Douglas has contributed to trying to get this offensive line figured out and fixed is not a problem for me, right? Generally, he's invested 1 to 3 free agents every offseason, 1 to 2 draft picks every draft cycle, right? And I think those are generally, I couldn't put a number to it, but I would say that's probably in a range of acceptable to above average compared to most other NFL GMs. Although it's worth mentioning, other NFL GMs generally have more than 1 or 2 spots figured out on the offensive line, and so it's maybe not as necessary. They can spend a late round draft pick, kind of build a pipeline, hope to develop a guy, whereas Joe Douglas hasn't been afforded that luxury. I get more irritable with the situation of Not only his inability to scout the right talent for the Jets, I guess you could say, but also his decision making when it came to which guys he felt should stay on the roster. And at a time where we've been flush with cap space for most of Joe Douglas's tenure so far, there are question marks, right? Obviously, you have your Morgan Moses that have walked out on us, but then you had guys like Nick Herbig that looked great. And could have developed into something, right? Obviously, the Steelers have been able to make it worthwhile for them. And then, other decision-making skills when it comes to draft and guys that we brought in and what we've seen so far. Relying on bringing in guys like Billy Turner, you can question the Tomlinson pick, although that was supposed to be one of the more safe free agent pickups at the time that just really soured. So I don't know who's to blame there really ultimately other than Tomlinson himself. But Dwayne Brown, relying on him again, Max Mitchell, Billy Turner, it's really question mark after question mark after question mark. You can even go back to AVT, and although he's our best offensive lineman when he's healthy, it does sting a little bit more that we sacrificed 2 third-round picks to pick him up, where maybe we could have invested an additional resource there. Although there was a guard, Wyatt, that I think got picked up, and I forget who the other one was with what those picks would have been for us. So not like we really missed out a ton, but I'm sure there's a underrated guard or tackle that got picked up in that class that would have been useful for us. Nonetheless, though, it is a shot, and it is something that's going to be at the forefront of a lot of these conversations from the New York Jets, and it doesn't go much further than the draft, right? Immediately when you go and look at that, almost every pick in generic mock drafts, if there's an offensive tackle available from the big 3, or I guess you could even say the big 2, it's going to be that, right? Fashanu, some of the crazier ones were Joe Alt still available. And then you do have the underrated Talisa Fuaga pick that's been coming up more frequently if the other 2 guys, as expected, are off the board. And I do think that makes the most sense, right? I won't dive into it here. We'll save that for whenever I can drop a mock draft or do one live anyways. But it is going to be an extremely big precedence, right? You can argue that we still need 2 starting tackles with Mekhi Becton being a question mark. You can argue if it's worth just eating the dead cap charge and moving on from Tomlinson. Do you want to try to get a strong insurance plan for AVT in case he can't be healthy? What is ultimately going to be his spot still? And then you have all of the depth pieces you still need to worry about. So, check off AVT, check off Joe Tippmann. You still have a lot of concerns on this roster, right? A lot of hope, once again, which as we seen last year didn't work out well for the New York Jets. Your best bet is hopefully Carter Warren shows out more so than you expected him to develop. Maybe Max Mitchell can turn that corner once again. But yeah, definitely still a lot of things that need to get figured out. And so Aaron Rodgers, I think, will solve a lot of the usage problems when it comes to Breece Hall, but in terms of his protection up front, being able to actually get some rushing lanes to open that he doesn't have to pull a magic trick out of his hat for to get a long-scoring touchdown play or some decent, significant rushing lanes, that is going to be on Joe Douglas to have figured out. And so not a great free agent class. The draft, there's only so many picks to go around and so many talented offensive linemen to try to select. We'll see what his game plan ultimately looks like. But let me know what your guys' thoughts are on Breece Hall's criticisms here, and I'll catch you again. Peace.